So we are on the third week of the 7 Haftorahs of comfort, beginning at the Shabbat after the 9th of Av, which is the day that the temple was destroyed, all the way to Rosh Hashanah. The 7 weeks we read 7 Haftorahs of comfort, all from the book of Isaiah. We read 2 already, and now we are reading the third. And the theme of the third one is different than the first 2. The theme of the first one, briefly, is that God says he will comfort the people, and for God's own sake. In other words, we're not sure that the people were deserving, but God says in order to show his own glory, he's going to comfort and bring the people back to Jerusalem. That was week number 1. Week number 2, we read about the theme of, let's see if I can remember. Week number 2, Azavani Hashem. Zion says God has forsaken me. And the prophet speaks to the people and tells the people how even though they're in exile, God has not forsaken them. And we mentioned that there were 3 points that the prophet makes. Number 1, a mother does not abandon her child. Even if a mother would abandon her child, God would not abandon you. That's the first image of a parent. And then we had the second image of a mighty person would not let go of something precious to him. And God, in addition to being our parent, we are also his cherished people, as the verse says in Exodus, before God gave us the Torah. And the third point was that there was no bill of divorce. There was no bill of divorce, and therefore the bond is strong even when in exile. So that was last week. And now we have this week. And this week Isaiah continues to comfort the people, but the theme is different. And we're going to discuss that for a minute. But the opening phrase of the Haftorah is Aniya Soara Lo Nuchama, which is basically saying a poor, tempestuous one who was not consoled. The Jewish people were in poverty because we were still in exile, and we have not been comforted. Why have we not been comforted? Have we not taken last week's message to heart? So the answer is we could very well have taken God's message to heart, last week's message to heart that God sent through the prophets. Nevertheless, we're still not comforted. Why not? So there are really 2 general problems with the exile. Number 1 is the emotional problem. Number 2 is the practical problem. What do I mean? The emotional problem, I mean that we feel that God abandoned us. That is something that the prophet has reassured us last week, that God has not abandoned us. Okay, that's very good to know. So it helps our psychological, emotional state of being. The problem is we're still suffering. We're still in poverty. And if we're still in poverty, then the fact that God has not abandoned us, we're still his people, but that doesn't solve the problem that we are suffering in exile. And that is what this Haftorah is addressing. This Haftorah is addressing that God will bring us back to Jerusalem, and there's tremendous expressions of wealth that come along in this Haftorah of consolation for the first time. Now, up to this point, the first 2 Haftorahs that we read, we did not hear anything about a promise of wealth. But in this Haftorah, it's all about wealth, certainly in the beginning. The riches, the gold, the precious stones, that will be all over Jerusalem. So why are we all of a sudden talking about wealth? So there could be a few angles to this. But if the opening words of the Haftorah is Aniyah, the impoverished woman, Aniyah Soara, the woman who's poor, the Jewish people were poor. In other words, yes, God, even if we understood and internalized the message from last week, that God has not abandoned us, we're still connected to God. So that could help us psychologically and emotionally and spiritually, but it's not going to solve our problem of suffering in the physical realm. And that's why the prophet says, don't worry, there's going to be a tremendous amount of wealth, as we will read and discuss. So that's the first half of the Haftorah. It's relatively short Haftorah. The second half of the Haftorah is also about wealth, but this time it's not physical wealth, it's more spiritual wealth. So I mentioned earlier that in the first week of the Haftorahs of comfort, God makes the point that he is going to comfort the people and bring them back to Jerusalem in order for the in other words, for the honor of God. If God's people are in exile, then people think God is powerless. So in other words, to reinstate the glory of God, for his own sake, he will bring us back to Jerusalem. But that means that our spiritual state of being is not necessarily relevant, but also it means that it's not necessarily are we worthy of the comfort, are we worthy of redemption? Because why is God redeeming us? Not because we're worthy, but because he has no choice. His reputation is on the line. Let me finish the point, Jill. In this Haftorah, what are we going to talk about in the second half of the Haftorah? The prophet demands that the people refine themselves and the people become worthy of the Haftorah, of the comfort. He says, go drink water, which means study Torah. He says, distance yourself from oppression. He says, get involved in charity. And what's really happening is that the prophet is saying it's not enough to get the redemption and the comfort because God is providing it to us, but we have to transform and we have to become worthy of this redemption. So in short, and then we'll take Jill's question, in short, the theme of this Haftorah is wealth, both physical wealth in the beginning of the Haftorah and then spiritual wealth in the second half of the Haftorah. Again, in the beginning of the Haftorah, yes, maybe God promised us that he has not abandoned us. Maybe we accept that, then we do, but we're still suffering, we're still impoverished. And the point here is God says, don't worry, in the future, there's going to be a tremendous amount of wealth. That's comforting for the poverty that we experience in exile. But now that we move to talk about the wealth, now we say, but we also need spiritual wealth. What does spiritual wealth mean? We have to be deserving of the redemption, and that's through our own work to transform ourselves and make ourselves connected to the concepts of justice and distancing ourselves from oppressing and others and connecting to the Word of God. So that's the overarching theme of the Haftorah. Now we're going to take Jill's question, and then we're going to get into the details and read the verses and read the commentary on the verses and hopefully take it to heart, which is the point. Go ahead, Jill.
Maybe we should just read it because I was questioning the language.
Okay, so we'll read a little. You jump in when if something is not clear.
All right, I'll do the first thing. I will set your stones with carbuncles. I know what a carbuncle is, and it's a pussy growth on your body. So when you set stones with carbuncles, and I will lay your foundations with sapphires, the language itself does not convey a particular message. It's confusing.
Apparently, carbuncle can also mean a type of precious stone, because that's what Rashi says. Rashi says puch could also mean a precious stone. And the idea is that the streets of Jerusalem, the stones will be set, right? If you have to set a stone, you set a stone in with something else, and the stone has to have a frame. So even the frame for the stones of Jerusalem will be made of puch, which Rashi says is a precious stone.
Okay, because the definition in the dictionary is that it's a indication of disease.
Got it. Okay, this I don't know.
Okay, so that was the other, and then when it says on the beginning of the next one, again, it's the language. All who go thirst go to water, go and buy and eat without money and without a price, wine and milk. So you're speaking about spirituality, but if we're talking about practical things, if you're going to go and buy without money, you're talking about something that is not of this world.
Right.
And it plays with what exactly are you offering? What are you telling us? You sort of described it in general, but the language is so, for me, it's misleading.
Okay, so let's read. Remember, it's poetic, so it's supposed to be a little vague. It's supposed to have multiple meanings. So we have to give it a little bit, right? We're reading poetry, not prose. So we have to keep that in. We have to keep that in mind. But we'll get there. Well, let's make our way. Let's make our way through the Haftorah. We'll do a verse at a time. We'll read it inside. See what the commentaries are saying. But again, the overarching idea is, what are we referring to here? There's an expression of tremendous wealth in Jerusalem in the first few verses. And then we talk about the demand that the people themselves be worthy of the redemption. In other words, in the beginning of the Haftorah, it's physical wealth, and the end of the Haftorah is spiritual wealth. Spiritual wealth means we are worthy of redemption, as opposed to just getting it because God has no choice. His reputation is on the line. Everyone knows we are his people. If he doesn't bring us back to Jerusalem, that means God is powerless. So in the first Haftorah of comfort, that seems to be the idea. It doesn't say so explicitly, but that seems to be the idea, that God is saying, I have to bring you back on my behalf. There's no mention of repentance. There's no mention of justice. There's no mention of coming to listen to the God's words. It's just God is going to bring you back. Why? Because God is almighty. Right? So that's wonderful. But then the question becomes, that's spiritual poverty. We are being gifted the gift of redemption, or the gift of comfort. Here we're talking about, we're tired of the poverty. We want wealth, both physical wealth, but also in the second half of the Torah, spiritual, and the second half of the Haftorah, spiritual wealth as well. So let's read through the verses. We'll see what's happening. So I'm going to read the English translation. Some of these words I'm going to get stuck because I don't know what these stones are, but here we go. O poor tempestuous one. I have no idea what that word means, but so'ara means, it comes from the word storm. It's like an image of a boat in the stormy waters. It cannot find any peace. It cannot find any tranquility. Lo nuchama, who was not consoled. So that's the prophet. The prophet comes back to God and said, look, the people, you told me to comfort the people have not accepted the comfort. So now the prophet speaks on behalf of God. Behold, I will set your stones with carbuncle, and I will lay your foundations with sapphires. Sapirim, sapphires, precious stones. In other words, even the foundation of the home or the foundation of the city are going to be made out of sapphire. You see, you have to understand, the foundation is irrelevant. Nobody could see the foundation, right? You want to really build beautiful on top of the earth. But here the point is, the wealth will be so tremendous that even the foundations of the city will be made of sapphire, of precious stones. Okay, fine. That's verse 1. Now, just to point out, up till this point, the prophet, in the first two prophecies, the prophet has spoken about Jerusalem. But what did he tell Jerusalem? He didn't tell Jerusalem anything about Jerusalem herself. What he told Jerusalem is that you will be comforted by the fact that your children will return to you. That was the imagery. The imagery was that she is an akara, Jerusalem is a barren woman, and the barren woman sees all the children coming back, and then she says, where did these children come from? So the prophet is talking to Jerusalem, is saying Jerusalem will be rebuilt. But what does it mean rebuilt? Up to this point, he wasn't talking about the actual structure, the actual stones, the actual physical city of Jerusalem. He was saying the comfort would be that your children come home. Okay, your children can come home. The city could still be destroyed. So now we go to the next step. Not only will you come home, but the city itself will be rebuilt. Not only rebuilt the way it was in the second temple when Ezra and Nehemiah came back and they were very poor, but it will be rebuilt with a tremendous amount of wealth. So that is the thing. That's the first verse. I will make your windows of jasper and your gates of carbuncle stones, and all your border of precious stones. So again, we're going to try to later when we get to the mystical part of the class, we'll talk about that stone. I will make your windows of jasper. What does that word mean? I mean, jasper, I guess, is a stone, but the Hebrew is a little bit different. So we're going to talk about that. And according to the Kabbalah, the various stones mentioned here are each one signify something different, and we're going to get to that, hopefully, God willing, at the end of the lesson. But it's clear that that verse 11 is talking about the precious stones on the floors, on the foundations, and verse 12 is talking about the gates, the borders, and the windows will all be of precious stones. Okay, sounds good to me. Next, so the city is rebuilt. What about the children? What about the people of the city? Verse 13, and all your children shall be disciples of the Lord, and your children's peace shall increase. Okay, so in other words, what are we going to do? We have all this wealth. So what are we going to do? We're going to play the stock market? No. What we're going to do is, where the children are going to be the students, disciples of the Lord. Limudei Hashem. The word limudei comes from the word learning. We will be the disciples of the Lord. So in other words, the fact that we have the wealth, the purpose is not for the wealth per se, but the purpose is that the people have the wealth. So the wealth allows them to become the disciples of the Lord. This is similar to what Maimonides quotes from Isaiah, which Isaiah says that when Mashiach comes, the whole earth will be filled with the knowledge of God. In other words, even though there'll be tremendous wealth and there'll be tremendous pleasure, but the pleasure that the people will seek will be the pleasure of the knowledge of God. So that's verse 13. After 11 and 12 discuss the tremendous wealth that the Jewish people of Jerusalem will possess. We say, but what will the children of Jerusalem do? We will be studying Torah, becoming the disciples of God. And then this is very interesting. The end of the verse, Merav Shloim Banoich, and your children's peace shall increase. Merav Shloim will have a lot of peace. So you say you study Torah and you have a lot of peace. Why do you have so much peace? So this is very interesting. So there's all kinds of interpretations. First interpretation I'm going to say is from a Kabbalistic commentator, the Alshich, who lived in Tzfat in the 16th century. He was one of the inner group of the famous Kabbalists of Tzfat. Says the Alshich. He says, what happens when people are into wealth? When people are into wealth, by definition, there's competition, right? We live in a Kabbalistic society. People, if they wouldn't be competitive, they would not, the capitalistic society will break down. In other words, their idea of competition and the idea of rivalry is important in the acquisition of wealth. And that's the state of mind that people are in the state of exile. But when Mashiach comes, as the piece of Maimonides that I mentioned earlier says, that there will be, when Mashiach comes, there'll be no war and there'll be no competition. Why will there be no competition? You know, you see people, they have $1 billion, but their neighbor has $2 billion, so they're very upset. They want more. They want to be on the top of the Forbes 500 or 400. They don't want to be number 36. That's a shame. That's shameful. You're only number 217. You could be 215, right? So there's a tremendous amount of competition built into the psyche of the human psyche during exile. But Maimonides says when Mashiach comes, there will be no more competition. Why will there be no more competition? Because all we're going to want is we're going to want to know God. And if you want to know God, then the physical possessions that you have or you don't have, you'll have plenty of them, but that's not going to be so important to you, and therefore you're not going to be competing over it, and therefore the peace will increase. So in other words, if you look at Maimonides, when he describes the coming of Mashiach, he says there'll be no more famine, no more war, no more competition. There's going to be plenty of good. And then he says something interesting. He says, all the pleasures will be like earth, and will be present like earth. So the simple meaning is there'll be such an abundance of pleasure, of pleasurable things, that people won't have to compete because there's enough for everybody. But then there's the Hasidic interpretation. The Hasidic interpretation is that all the physical pleasures not will be as plenty as earth, or as dust, but they'll be considered as dust. In other words, people won't value them. So what we value will change. And because what we value change, what we value will change, therefore the competition and the warfare ceases. And the animosity ceases. And it seems like this verse, according to the Alshich, is referring to this idea. Since all your children are going to be students of God, that's 13. Despite the fact that we all have wealth and sapphire and all the other precious stones mentioned in the verses, so we're going to have a tremendous amount of wealth. But what are the people going to want? The people are going to be busy with studying the Torah, and if they're studying the Torah, therefore, v'rav shalom, there's much peace because we're not going to be competing over the physical resources and the physical wealth. That's one point. Now there's another fascinating interpretation, absolutely fascinating, on verse 13. If you look back at the Talmud, okay, so let's see. So you have exile. Why does exile happen? Exile happens as a result of sin. So now you have redemption. What happens by redemption? It's not enough. It's not sufficient to just bring the people back to Jerusalem. Why? Because if the cause, the sin that caused the people to be exiled has not been corrected, then what does it help to bring them back to Jerusalem? They're going to sin again and be exiled again, right? So somehow or another, if you're saying you're comforting the people and you're bringing them back to Jerusalem and you're going to rebuild Jerusalem, you also have to make sure that you're not just rebuilding the physical foundations of the city, but you're also rebuilding the spiritual foundations of the city, correcting those mistakes that allowed for the destruction of the temples. Okay, so now, what was the cause of the destructions of the temple? So the first temple, the prophets say the reason why the temple was destroyed because the people abandoned the Torah. They abandoned the Torah. The second temple was destroyed. Why? We all know this. The Talmud talks about it. It's well known. The Talmud says that the second temple was destroyed because of sinas chinam, because people had senseless hatred. They hated each other, even though there was no reason to hate each other. It was just an irrational hate. So we have two problems. In other words, two causes that brought about the destruction. Cause number one is the abandonment of Torah. That was the first temple. The destruction of the second temple is the infighting amongst the Jewish people. That's what verse 13 comes to say. Verse 13 comes to say that not only will the physical foundations in the physical city of Jerusalem be rebuilt, but rather the cause of the destruction will be corrected, and the people will, number one, will become disciples of God. That's the study of Torah, correcting the mistake that led to the destruction of the first temple. And then, the people will live with increased peace, and that's correcting the mistake that led to the second temple, to the destruction of the second temple. So verse 13 corrects both mistakes that caused both sins that caused the destruction of the first and second temple. I thought that's a beautiful interpretation.
Whose interpretation was that?
Honestly, I don't know. The book is called Sha'ar Bas Rabim. Sha'ar Bas Rabim. I go check up who the author is. I have to double check. I don't know. You stumped me. But the name of the book is Sha'ar Bas Rabim. I could look it up later. Okay, we continue down our journey. Verse 14. Verse 14. With righteousness shall you be established. Again, righteousness is not a perfect translation. It's tzedakah. Tzedakah in Judaism could be translated as righteousness, could be translated as charity. And I don't want to go into this right now, but it's really very much connected, even though superficially righteousness and charity are two different words, because righteousness seems like justice, and charity means more than justice, right? If I'm deserving of something, it's not charity. If it's charity, then I'm not deserving. But in Judaism, the word of charity, tzedakah, means righteousness, which means the person who's giving, the attitude of the giver has to be that when I give somebody who's less fortunate, that's actually the right thing to do. That's justice. Why is it justice? Because God gave me so I can give the other person. But that's another discussion. I don't want to go into that too much. But bitzdaka tikonani, so I'm translating it not as righteousness, but as justice, as charity. With charity, you shall be established. Go far away from oppression, for you shall not fear, and from ruin, for it will not come near you. What is the prophet telling us? The prophet tells you, and this is what I mentioned earlier, that if we become worthy of redemption, if we're to become worthy of redemption, we have to incorporate into our life the idea of tzedakah, of righteousness and charity, and we have to distance ourselves from oppressing others, and then the evil will separate from us. So again, in the big picture, it's saying we have to earn the the right, we have to be worthy of the redemption, and then that's how we become spiritually wealthy as well. Now we move to 15. Behold, the one with whom I am not shall fear. Whoever mobilizes against you shall defect to you. In other words, but now that we discussed how we are now worthy of redemption, God is with us, we do charity, we distance ourselves from justice, God will protect us, and those who gather against us will not be successful. Okay. Verse 16 and 17 is actually very poetic. God is saying, because God is the one who creates the possibility of creating warfare, therefore God will protect us against it. So it's very poetic. Let's read 16 and 17. Behold, I have created a smith who blows on a charcoal fire and produces a weapon for his work. And I have created a destroyer to destroy. In other words, the capacity to create warfare. Who's responsible for that? God is responsible for that. Verse 17, nevertheless, any weapon, not nevertheless, I'm adding, any weapon weathered against you shall not succeed, and any tongue that contends with you in judgment you shall condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their due reward from me, says the Lord. Okay, so it seems like an idea. We're saying if we do justice, because we're going to do justice, because we're going to distance ourselves from oppression, therefore we're protected. Why are we protected? Those people who come to warfare against us will not be successful. Why? Says God, I'm the one who designed the warfare. If I'm the one who designed the warfare, I give the people the power for the smith to make weapons, then I'm telling you that any weapon formed against you will not be successful. Beautiful. And now we get to the commentary on verse 16 and 17. And it's interesting, not enough just to read the commentary, but it's actually most interesting to understand the people and the sages who offer this commentary and realize that they're responding to events in their times. In other words, they're looking at the newspaper, they're looking at the current events, and then looking back at Isaiah and say, you know, Isaiah was referring to this specific case. So what am I referring to? So on verse 17, there is a commentary by the Abarbanel. Who's the Abarbanel? Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, Mr. Isaac Abarbanel. He was a great Jewish sage who passed away in the 16th century, but he was the minister of finance for the king of Spain during the time of the Jewish peoples, before the people were expelled from Spain. And he was involved with trying to persuade the king and queen not to expel the Jews. And he was a very prolific writer. He wrote a commentary on the Torah and on the Tanakh and on the prophets. And he says as follows. He divides verse 17 into two. And he says there's two parts of this verse. Number one is that God is telling us that people who use force against us will not be successful. That's the first phrase, the first clause. The second clause is, and any tongue that contends with you in judgment, you shall condemn. Or you shall be victorious over. Tarshi, you will condemn them. What exactly does that mean? So Abarbanel was looking around in his time, and he says there's two ways that people try to oppress the Jews. Number one, the people tried to force the Jews to convert by force of the sword and tell them that if they don't convert, they will be killed. He says that was the Muslims in his times. Later it became the Christians too, but that's another story. But then he says that's the first clause. What's the second clause? The second clause is any tongue. Verse 17, any tongue that contends with you in judgment, you shall condemn. Says that Abarbanel, this refers to the nations, especially the Christian nations in Europe, who forced the Jews to have debates about the religion, in other words, debates between Christianity and Judaism. And the prophet says that these two methods that people try to destroy the Jews, either by weapons or by trying to debate them and persuade them that their religion is false, both those methods will not be successful. That is what Abarbanel said, and I think it's clear that he's talking to his own time and his own people, the people in his era who were suffering terribly on both these accounts, both by the pressure of the sword, as well as the theological pressure of the debates that the Christian kings would force the Jewish people to engage in. And here Isaiah says that both of these will not be successful against the Jewish people. So I just like this verse because you see how Rabbi Bernal is reading these verses and applying it to his time. Okay. There's more to say, but unfortunately, the clock is ticking, so I want to keep going. By the way, if anyone has any comments or questions or jokes, jump in, don't hesitate. Okay, now we get to Isaiah chapter 55. And here we're getting poetic. You know what? Here's what we're going to do. We're going to read the next 4 verses, which is the conclusion of the Haftorah, the next 5 verses, and then we'll discuss the verses specifically, just to get the big picture. Ho, it's like behold, hi, ho, all whom thirst, go to water, and whoever has no money, go buy and eat. And go buy without money and without a price, wine and milk. So this is already a problematic verse. Jill pointed out, what does it mean? If you have no money, how do you buy wine and milk? Okay, we'll deal with that in a minute. That's verse 1. Verse 2. Why should you weigh out money without bread and your toil without satiety? In other words, satiety. In other words, why would you spend money without getting bread? Why would you toil without being satisfied in return? Hearken to me and eat what is good, and your soul shall delight in fatness. Fatness means pleasure. Fatty foods are pleasurable. Incline your ear and come to me. Hearken, and your soul shall live, and I will make for you an everlasting covenant, the dependable mercies of David. Behold, a witness to nations have I appointed him, a ruler and a commander of nations. Behold, a nation that you did not know, you shall call, and a nation that you did not, and a nation that did not know you shall run to you for the sake of the Lord your God and for the Holy One of Israel, for he glorified you. So what are we saying in the last few verses? First of all, we're saying everyone go drink water, and you should buy bread. I'm sorry, if you don't have money, you get wine and milk without money, whatever that means. And then he says, don't spend money if you're not getting anything in return. That would be a shame. And verse 3 says, listen to me, and listen, and your soul will live. And you'll be like David, who became a leader to nations. And you too will become a leader to nations. How will you become a leader to nations? That's verse 5. Even nations who you never heard of will come to you because of the glory of God, who God glorified you. That's the conclusion of the Haftorah. So I want to just talk a second, generally put it into the context of what we said earlier, and then we're going to start drilling down on these verses because there's so much to say. So again, the big picture is that we're going to talk about the prophet wants the people to be worthy of redemption. He wants transformation. He wants them to listen to the word of God and internalize the word of God. The idea of drinking water, the idea of eating food represents internalization. So we want to internalize the word of God in order that we should be worthy of the redemption. Okay, now we're going to go one verse at a time and take this apart and realize that and see what's happening here. So let's start with the simple meaning. The simple meaning is verse 1. Everybody go drink water. If you're thirsty, drink water. If you don't have money, go eat anyway, because the wine and the milk are free. It doesn't say that they're free, but that's what it means. It means that the food is free, right? Let's read it again, according to this interpretation. Ho, all who thirst, go to water. And whoever has no money, go buy and eat. But the word buy is shivru. Shivru literally means to break, like breaking your hunger. So it means to acquire. It doesn't mean to buy necessarily. So those who have no money, go acquire and eat, and go buy without money, without a price, wine and milk. What is he saying? Wine and milk have no price. So in other words, the food is plentiful. If you're thirsty, go drink water. If you're hungry, go eat. You don't have money, it doesn't matter that you don't have money, because there's no price for it, meaning it's free. So you can read this simply. There'll be an abundance of water and abundance of food. But it's the second half of the Haftorah. So we're talking about this is spiritual wealth. So therefore, the commentaries explain that this is not water per se. This is thirsting for knowledge, thirsting to connect to God. And when it says, "Hay kol sameh," ho, all thirsty people go to water, says the Talmud. What's water? The Torah is likened to water. There are many reasons why the Talmud likens the water to Torah. If we have time, we'll get into it. But the Torah is likened to water. So we're saying if you thirst to God, go drink water. That will satisfy you. That will quench your thirst. There's no other way to quench your thirst, to feel connected to God other than studying Torah. If you claim you have no money, meaning you don't have the capacity, it doesn't matter. It's free for all. That is the simple interpretation of this verse. Now we have the more Kabbalistic interpretation. What's the more Kabbalistic interpretation? The more Kabbalistic interpretation is as follows. There are there's two people that, in other words, there's a few groups of people here. One group of people, they thirst for God. So that's easy. If you're thirsty, go drink water. If you're thirsty, go quench it with the study of Torah. Now, it's not so obvious. In other words, let's point this out for a second. It's not so obvious. It's not so obvious. In other words, the question is, why do you have to tell someone if you're thirsty, drink water? Isn't that obvious? The answer is that thirsting, it's not so clear. People are thirsting for God. I'm thirsting for God. How will the Torah help me? So that's what the prophet is telling you. If you're thirsting for God, if you want to feel close to God, the way you feel close to God, the only way to quench the thirst is go to Mayim and go to Torah. So that's the first point. The first point is people who thirst for God. They have a yearning to connect to God. The prophet says, go drink the Torah, go drink the water, go drink Torah. Now the problem is someone who has no money. Now, according to the Kabbalah, the word kesef, the word money, in Hebrew, the word money and the word silver is the same. We mentioned it, I think, last week. Money is silver. Silver is something that is desirable. So in biblical Hebrew, the word kesef means yearning. If you look at the book of Genesis, when Jacob escapes his father-in-law Lavan, and Lavan gets upset that Jacob escaped, he chases him, and he confronts him, and he said, "Why did you leave? Because you yearned for your father's home." And he says, "Nichsof nichsafta," yearning, you have yearned. So kesef is yearning. Because kesef is desirable, kesef is silver. Kabbalistically and linguistically, it's the same etymology of the word kesef and the word yearning, the word for money and the word yearning. And what the prophet is saying here is as follows, according to the Kabbalistic interpretation. Those who thirst, study Torah, and the Torah will quench your thirst. And those who don't thirst for God, one second, Jill, those who don't thirst, they don't feel a desire for spirituality. I'm perfectly fine. I'm not thirsty for God. Why would I study Torah? So then the prophet says, you know what? Go eat without money. You engage in the study of Torah, even without money. In other words, even without yearning. And the process of studying Torah will then create the yearning. And then you will get not only the food, but you will also get, the conclusion of the verse is, yayin v'chalav, you would get wine and milk. Wine and milk represent the secrets of Torah, the luxury. In other words, Torah has two parts. Torah has the laws. You have to know what to do. That's not wine and milk. That is necessity. That's bread. That's the staple. The wine and milk of Torah represents the secrets of Torah, the great wisdom that connects you, that is embedded within the secrets of the Torah. So according to the Kabbalists, what this verse is saying is, number one, if you're thirsty, study Torah. And the Torah will quench your thirst. If you're not thirsty, it doesn't matter. Engage within it anyway. Go eat it without money. Go eat it without yearning. And then you will get not only the food of Torah, but you'll get the secrets of the Torah. In other words, engaging in the words of Torah will itself create the yearning. Why would I study Torah? If I'm yearning for God, studying Torah will quench my thirst. If I'm not yearning for God, why will I study Torah? Well, if you're not yearning for God, the study of Torah will create that yearning. And then you won't be satisfied with the food. You'll also want the luxury of Torah. You'll want the secrets of Torah. That's the wine of Torah and the milk of Torah. And then, if water and wine and food here all represent the Torah, now we move to the next verse. The next verse says, why would you weigh out money without bread? And why would you toil without satiety? Hearken to me and eat what is good, and your soul shall delight in fatness. So there are various interpretations what that means. But some of the commentaries say as follows. The prophet is saying, why are you running after the various cultures and pursuing their wisdom? Their wisdom is not going to satisfy you. It's not going to be food for you. It's not going to give you spiritual nourishment. So you're giving out money. You're giving out your yearning for foreign cultures and foreign forms of wisdom. But he says, why would you give money if you're not getting bread in return? You're not getting this food that will actually satisfy you. And why would you toil without being satisfied? What should you do instead? In other words, so this is a continuation to the previous verse. Previous verse is, if you're thirsty, come to the Torah. The Torah will satisfy you. And verse 2 says, you're thirsting for knowledge, but you're looking for the knowledge in the wrong place. You're pursuing other knowledges that ultimately will not satisfy you. And therefore, the end of verse 2 is, the conclusion of verse 2 is, hearken to me and eat what is good, and your soul shall delight in fatness. In other words, to come to God, internalize God's wisdom, and then you will experience the true pleasure. And ultimately will also affect the rest of the world. That is verse 4 and 5. So that is the story in short of the simple meaning of the Haftorah. Just to point out one, okay, we'll leave it at this. On Friday, God willing, when we study Hasidic philosophy, perhaps we'll discuss the Haftorah and offer an additional Kabbalistic interpretation, because it's I can't do justice to it in a minute or two, but so maybe we'll spend time on Friday on a more Kabbalistic angle of this Haftorah. But in short, just to summarize, we said this Haftorah is telling us that the Jewish people, even though they heard that God has comforted them, but they still feel in poverty. They still feel that they're out in the storming sea. We have not found comfort. Why not? Because we're still suffering. Even if God had not abandoned us, but we're still suffering in the physical sense. And that's what the prophet says, don't worry. Eventually the time will come and we'll be not only we're back to Jerusalem, but also with tremendous wealth. And because we're talking about wealth, we say redemption is not just physical wealth, it's also spiritual wealth. And the spiritual wealth means correcting those mistakes that led to the destruction to begin with. And that's the ideas of justice and the idea of separating from oppressing others, and the idea of internalizing the word of God, which is the eating of the food and the drinking of the water and quenching our thirst with the knowledge of God. And then the idea that pursuing other forms of knowledge is wonderful, but ultimately it's not going to satisfy us. Ultimately, if you want satisfaction, you have to do what the verse says. I believe it was verse 17? No, verse 2. Hearken to me and eat what is good, and your soul shall delight in fatness. So this is the story in short. If anybody has any comments or questions or jokes, go ahead.
I have a question, Rabbi. On the last one, on 5, behold, a nation you do not know shall call, and a nation that did not know you shall run to you. What was that a reference to in the time of Isaiah?
So this is simply nations that live in the distance will actually come to Israel to be affected by.
Yeah, I understand the general meaning of it, but what was that in reference to? Do you have any idea?
No, because Isaiah is talking about the future. He's not talking about his days. He's talking about in the future, in the Messianic era, all the nations of the world. Isaiah says this. Isaiah says this elsewhere, that all the people on the earth will come to the temple. All the people of the earth will come to serve God. So here he's saying it in other words. Even a nation you never heard of will come to you. And why? For the sake of God, who has made you glorious. In other words, the nations of the world coming to be influenced from the Jewish people, just like it was in the days of Solomon, when the Queen of Sheba came to Jerusalem. In the days of the Mashiach, it will be even more so, that the energy of Jerusalem will have this magnetic pull and pull all the people of the earth to seek godliness.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Rabbi,
Yes.
you just mentioned nations that you never heard of will come to you. What is the Kabbalistic meaning of that?
That's a good question. I have to think about it. I have to look for it. Simply, it means that back in the day, there was no Twitter and no email and no BBC World Service. And therefore, you knew the few nations that were around you, right? But you didn't know the nations that lived in the distance. So spiritually, it could mean not just geographical difference, but cultural difference. Even people who are so distant from you that they seemingly have no connection to your values, they too will be attracted to what Judaism teaches. So perhaps that's the Kabbalistic meaning. Or someone you did not know, meaning to say, it's sometimes, you see, there's monotheistic faiths. So we have the general idea of believing in one God, and we're talking about, but we disagree about the details. Okay, that's a nation that's close to you, at least you could communicate with. But then there are nations that have nothing in common with you culturally, or nothing in common with you theologically. So that they don't know you. In other words, we don't have anything in common spiritually. But in the end of days, the magnetic pull of holiness will be so powerful that even those nations will be drawn to Jerusalem.
Sounds like a good answer.
Thank you.
I have a comment / joke / opinion.
Okay.
Sounds like in the times of Mashiach, it's going to sound very much like a mixture of it's going to sound like a spiritual democratic socialist society.
That's not a joke. In other words, yes. In other words, there's no question that Mashiach comes, there's a utopia. There's enough for everybody, and everybody lives happily ever after, right? There's no question about that. The question is, how do you get there? And the question is, could you superimpose it prematurely? And that's where people debate about whether socialism is the best way to go in this state of being. But in other words, certainly when Mashiach comes and the values change, people are not looking for wealth. They're looking for knowledge. They're looking for the knowledge of God. So it's not that some other force imposes upon you whatever the economic system is. This is the people themselves are happy to share. People themselves are happy to do justice. So it's a little bit different, but in the bottom, in other words, you're getting a just world, but you're getting it because the people have been transformed.
Right. Thank you.
Rabbi?
Yes.
You. I have a question about verse 1. So whoever is thirsty will go to water, but the other group who does not have money, who doesn't desire, will get wine and milk. So what happened to the first group? Does the wine and milk, is it included in
everybody
in the Torah? So the first group will get it by default, right?
Right. There's 3 clauses, really. I didn't get into it, but there are 3 clauses. First clause, if you're thirsty, drink water. Second clause, if you have no money, if you have no desire, if you have no desire for Torah, don't worry. Go eat even without desire, because the eating itself will create the appetite. That's clause 2. And clause 3 is that when you study Torah, you will get not only the food of Torah, but you'll also get the mystical side of Torah, which is wine and milk. So that's the interpretation of, I think that's that Barbanel. But because you're a mystic, I'll give you Rabbi Shneir Zalman's interpretation, the Alter Rebbe's interpretation. Alter Rebbe's interpretation is as follows. Right? What did that Barbanel say? The first interpretation. Barbanel says, if you have no desire for Torah, study Torah, and that will, even without desire, and that will create the desire. Rabbi Shneir Zalman tweaks it a little bit. He says, if you have no desire, then you have to study Torah. But which parts of Torah do you have to study? Then you have to study the mystical part of Torah. You have to study the inner dimension of Torah, the wine and milk of the Torah, and that will give you the desire. In other words, the question is which part of Torah to study. So according to the classical interpretation, this verse has 3 clauses. According to the Rabbi Shneir Zalman's interpretation, this verse has 2 clauses, right? If you're thirsty, drink water, any part of Torah. If you're not thirsty, then you need the Kabbalistic part of Torah, because that's going to touch your soul much quicker. That's going to get to your spiritual core and awaken it and make you thirsty.
That was beautiful. Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you.
But there's one, well, I'd like to add one thing to that, Rabbi.
I'm sorry?
I'd like to add one comment to what you just said.
Go ahead.
If one is thirsty for the Torah, or he's looking for the deep Kabbalistic mystical meanings of the Torah, if he has no background in Torah, how can he find those?
So we're not talking about, so again, what the verse is really saying is, so first of all, you have to study. Studying is the way you find it. In other words, once you study, ultimately you'll uncover the wine and the milk.
Right.
The wine and the milk. You have to find the study partner. You have to find a teacher. You have to find the right book. You have to find the right book. But it's there. It's there. It's available.
Okay, so you have to have the thirst first before you can go delve into.
So there's 2 points. The first clause is if you have the thirst is wonderful. The second clause is even if you don't have the thirst, do it anyway. You engage in the Torah anyway, and that will the process of engagement in the Torah will awaken the thirst.
Yes, I understand that. But I was just.
And that's what we are doing. That's exactly what we are doing with your
No,
help.
you're thirsty, Vicky. You're thirsty.
No, but with your help, I just want to
Give us
thank.
some water. Give us some water.
Okay. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
You too.
Yashikol, Rabbi. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Neil. Thank you.
Yashikol.
Yashikol, Rabbi. Bye.